I'm Savannah Sipple. I'm an assistant professor of English here at Bluegrass Community and Technical College. I'm also a writer and a member of the LGBTQ community, and so I'm super excited we were able to host this conference, and I'm really thrilled at how many people have attended and joined us today. So I'm going to share my screen so that we can do the introduction. Hopefully it will pop up. Our first panelist is Ray Garringer. Sorry, I'm also letting people in from the lobby. Ray is a writer, oral historian, and audio producer who was raised on a sheep farm in southeastern West Virginia. She is the founder of Country Queers, which is an ongoing community-based oral history project that documents rural and small-town LGBTQ experiences across the U.S. Since 2013, the project has grown to include a collection of over 65 interviews, a gallery exhibit, a podcast, and Instagram takeovers. And she is deeply committed to the power of rural people telling their own stories. Kristen Smith is not with us today, but I wanted to just mention her briefly. She's a chef, and she owns a Wrigley Tap Room in Corbin. So if you're from that area or ever around that area, check it out. It's fantastic. She's fantastic. Keith Stewart is a CPA, and he owns 2 businesses in his hometown of Hyden, Kentucky. He is the author of the book Bernadette Peters Hates Me, which is a fantastic collection of essays. You should check it out. And he regularly contributes to Humor Outcast and the Good Men Project. He's been published in several journals and anthologies, and you can find him online at Shigley Yogli, and at Facebook, on Facebook is under A Strong Man's Cup of Tea. He lives in Hyden with Andy and their 2 dogs, Georgia and Dolly. So I'm going to stop sharing and we'll get started here in just a second. Okay. All right, Keith, Ray, thank you for joining us today. So one of the things I just want to have you talk about real quick. Well, not real quick, but just to start us off. We know that there are a lot of assumptions made about what it means to be rural and LGBTQ, or to be LGBTQ and live in a rural area, or to have grown up there. Being LGBTQ can be a challenge in a variety of ways. So just what I would like for us to do to start us off, I would like for each of you just talk a little bit about your experience being LGBTQ, growing up and living in a rural area, what that has meant for you, because every experience is different. And then we'll see who has questions, or I have some more questions we can discuss. Ray, let's start with you.
Oh, I was hoping I got to go last. I can go though. Whoa.
Sorry.
I knew it.
It was my phone.
I was like, that sounds like something bad is happening. So I grew up in southeastern West Virginia, on the border of Greenbrier and Pocahontas counties, about an hour outside of the closest town. And I rode the bus for 4 hours a day in high school. I didn't have a car, so I was pretty out there. hanging out with the sheep, hanging out in the woods. So I did not know that I wasn't aware that I was queer until I left for college. And I think part of that was I had never met an out queer person in West Virginia ever before leaving and then coming back years later. I'd met a couple older gay men who were like my mom's age, but I didn't like connect. I mean, I liked them a lot, but I wasn't like, oh, that's me. You know what I mean? And so it took me leaving, and I went to college in Western Massachusetts, and I had no idea that I had moved to a like very queer place, but I quickly figured that out and figured out that I was queer within my first semester. And but because of that, like the only queer people I knew who were my age were not from Appalachia. We're mostly not from the country. And after we graduated from college, pretty much all of them were trying to go to either New York or to the Bay. And there was a lot of anti-rural Southern stuff in Massachusetts that I experienced, but I just had no idea that I could go home. I didn't know that was like a possibility for me once I'd come out. And this was like early 2000s. And so I ended up moving to Austin, Texas for 4 years. And so about almost 10 years after leaving home, 9-ish, I moved back to West Virginia. And so, of course, 10 years into my queer journey or whatever, I was like, oh, there's queer. Look, that person's queer. That person's queer. You know what I mean? At the Walmart. Like, I just could see it differently. But I found myself really frustrated that I felt like I had been almost like lied to my whole life, that there are queer people here, that there have always been queer people here. I felt really frustrated that I hadn't known that, and I'd felt like I had to leave. And so most of my experience as a rural queer person has been as an adult, which I think often can be much easier, right? Because you're not in that, like, it's hard. I mean, middle school's hard for everybody. High school's hard for everybody. I think I didn't go through being an out young person here, but you know, now I love it. I never want to live not only in a city, but like I was trying to rent a house in a town that had like 30 houses, and I was like, I can't do this. There's too many people who can see me. So I don't plan to ever leave at this point. I mean, I've moved around in the region some, but there are definitely things that are challenging still. But I also think that I'm really grateful to have finally learned that I can have both of these parts of myself, like my home that I love so much and also my queerness, and that there are people all over who are making this work. It doesn't mean it's without struggle, but you know, there's moments of joy and there's a lot of fun in it. There's a lot of humor in it. So I think that's enough of a ramble for now.
Keith, what about you?
Well, like Ray, I grew up here, but very closeted. So I didn't have the experience of being out in middle school and in high school, and that life. I knew I was gay, but in the 80s, you weren't gonna say that here in Hyden, and I left for school and came back. And knew when I came out when I was like 25, so kind of late. But I knew at that point I was leaving. I was leaving Eastern Kentucky. And I did move to Florida, stayed in Florida for a few years. Eventually moved back to Lexington and really had no thoughts of returning back home to Eastern Kentucky, although I had business at that point here. I had just kind of just did it remotely. But I knew I probably would not live here again. And then family situations came up and I ended up coming back another, and I ended up being here almost on a permanent basis. I still have a house in Lexington, but I stay in Hyden most of the time at this point.
Okay. Thank you both for sharing a little bit of your background and your experiences. So, what are some of the assumptions that rural people make about the LGBTQ community, and how can we increase understanding?
I think I have been very surprised moving back, and I've been here for probably almost 8, 9 years at this point, of how accepted both Andy and I have been here. You know, we knew coming back that we were nervous because we weren't sure how we would be taken, and so I think my assumption moving back here was that it would not be good, you know, and there would be issues, but there haven't been any issues at all that have really come up that strictly because of our you know, relationship. So I think a lot, my expectations of rural people when we moved back were completely blown away by the acceptance that we had, and you know, I was very surprised, pleasantly surprised.
Yeah. I mostly have also had a pretty easy time with it. I mean, there are moments of things that are not ideal. I'd say the places I've actually had the most struggle have been in various jobs, in particular jobs working with young people, where I think still in the year 2021 there can be a lot of you know, there's some history of people thinking that like it's not safe to have young people around gay people, that, and I think some of that lingers in ways that are unfortunate. But I would say now that I'm sort of recently in a more self-employed realm, you know, it's pretty easy to avoid that. I will say, I feel like the people in my network and of friends and just folks I know kind of through my work who often have the hardest time, deal with the most direct and blatant like homophobia or transphobia are generally trans people, particularly people who are not passing, as they say, right? And so people who get read as like messing with gender, I think get deal with a lot more BS, I'll say, than people who don't in rural places and in city places, right? I mean, I think there's lots of statistics about trans women of color being murdered kind of across the US and stuff. And so I think that's true in rural spaces too. But again, I do think there is a piece of like, I think there can be a disconnect between like how things get talked about nationally and then how it makes sense to talk about things locally. And that's the thing that I find is like people might, it's like, I think particularly around gender, conversations get really like intense at a national level. And that can trickle down and make it really hard to have conversations locally. But I often think that, at least in my experience, and the you know, in small towns, people, it's so relationship based. It's like if people know you, if they know anything kind of about you that's positive, they're more likely to maybe hear a little bit about why this thing that seems scary in a national news context is actually like you and your friends, you know. And so I'm not sure if I answered that question, but that's what I had to say.
Well, so do you think that, you know, rural places tend to be smaller, less densely populated, or more spread out in terms of population and land mass, land area? But do you think that the key to creating understanding is building those kinds of relationships?
I do. I mean, I think, well, I think a few things. I think for a long time, right, I mean, media has changed so much, even since I started Country Queers, which is this ongoing project I work on, which was in 2013. There is so much more media that's easily accessible in rural places about queer people, about trans people, about non-binary people, right? That didn't exist even in 2013 and definitely didn't exist in 2000 or in 1999 or when, you know what I mean? And so in some ways, I think it's like these conversations are here in ways that they weren't when I was growing up, and it sounds like when you were growing up, Keith, right? And so I think for a long time, and when I do oral histories with people who are, you know, I'd say 50 and older, there's a lot of consistency of like, people have to know you, know that you're a good worker, know that you're a good neighbor, know that you're whatever before they'll accept you. And there was this message, I think, for a long time that you couldn't kind of come in waving flags and being really, you know. And I think that now that's still true in some ways. But I also think that like the world is just so much bigger and so much more. I mean, it's in our hands every day if we have a smartphone, right? And so I think it's shifted somewhat, because I think people can learn a lot on their own without knowing somebody. But I do still feel like that's something I love about living home and living in the region, is that it's so much about like, once you find out that you know 3 people in common, if you're meeting somebody new, then you're like almost friends already, you know, unless you don't like those 3 people in common that you know.
I agree. I think relationships always help with acceptance, you know, no matter where you are, but particularly in rural areas where people maybe don't know that they know gay people until, you know, they meet you, or you say, hey, you know, I'm gay, or this is my husband. They're like, oh, wow, okay. And I think that, at least here, my experience has been, I'm pretty sure a lot of people in the town I live in, we're probably the only gay people they know, you know, out gay people that they know. Or but surprisingly, here in Hyden, you know, we laughed when we first moved back, because I was like, we're going to be the most eccentric people, you know, in town. We're going to be those 2 weird people in town. And like the first day I was at work, this trans lady came in and just, you know, drop dead gorgeous, and works, you know, in the school system here and all this stuff. And I was like, dang it, we are not the most eccentric people now, you know, what are the odds? But so, I mean, I think there's more and more acceptance as people, you know, come out and you know, are seen in at work and doing things, you know, regular things that everyone does, everyone else does. Like, you know, like Ray was saying, like, you know, not waving flags and marching. And that, I think a lot of people, the assumption is, you know, oh, that's what's going to happen. But when they see that everybody just kind of does their own thing, and it's, I think the acceptance level goes up a whole lot.
Do any of our participants have questions they would want to ask? Feel free to type them in the chat or raise your hand, whatever you're comfortable doing. Okay, so we have a question in the chat. And it says, Ray mentioned how important relationships are in a small community, which I completely agree with. Have either of you found that this kind of relationship capital has affected how those in your network handle your expression of identity? And they give an example. For example, extended family that are upset you're out, not because they have a problem with it, but because they are afraid others in their lives will have a problem with it, and it will reflect back on them. Do either of you have a thought? I do, but go ahead.
I have, I'm sure I may not have the typical coming out story. I mean, we had problems when I came out in my family, people getting used to the situation. But I think it was easier for me when I first came out, because I lived in Florida, and you know, I was 800 miles away. And so by the time I moved back to where my extended family all is, it was over. You know, the controversy was pretty much over. And to my knowledge, no one in my extended family I didn't have that problem. But then I guess I'm a little bit different from a lot of people in this area in that my entire extended family were not that deeply religious like a lot of families are here in this area. So I didn't have that experience, but I know people, younger kids today that do have that experience. And I think being out here in Hyden kind of attracts, and I own a fast food restaurant, and I always laugh that every little gay child in the county ends up working there because, and I think it's kind of an attraction, to come. They know it's a safe place that they can come and work, and learn other things, and see other people like them interacting, and so, but from their experiences, I know that there are problems with, what that question was, afraid. Well, I accept you, but what will my church family think, or what will my, other friends and family think? So kind of keep it on the down low. I know that does happen.
Ray, do you have anything you would want to add?
Not really. So my extended family isn't in West Virginia or from the region. My parents moved here, and my parents are hippies. And so the only thing I'd say is that I thought they'd be completely fine because they're like very progressive. They're hippies. They were weirdos. We were all weirdos growing up, right? Locally in some ways. And so I mostly just was like very surprised when some of my parental figures had a hard time with it. I was like, what is happening? Like, I just didn't get it. So, but that's different sort of than the question. So that's all I have to say.
Okay. So the next question is, how do we increase acceptance, especially of queer youth in our communities? And this is specifically thinking about people who claim that kids are too young to know they're queer, or they're too young to even be discussing these things.
Well, I don't think this is true of all schools in rural areas. I don't think this is true of all schools in rural Appalachia, but I will say that the place that I have experienced as a queer adult the most homophobia and the hardest time just like navigating that was when I was working in rural public schools in West Virginia, and it felt like the most homophobic workplace I've ever existed in. I had a principal tell me that tolerance is a pro-gay buzzword, and we're not here to talk about that, when I was trying to do a like teaching tolerance activity with students. And so I guess all that is to say, I think I would never probably work in a public school again because of that experience, even though I really love working with young people and I love teaching. And so I think that's a problem if we're losing queer educators, because spaces where we can work with youth are incredibly homophobic. But I also think I just think schools are a really rich place where a lot could happen. And I think in schools where there is more possibility in terms of just like the administration's interest, I think that's a really good place to try to increase some programs that, in age appropriate ways, like talk about sexuality and gender. Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's a hard question. How do we increase the acceptance of this, especially, and like you were saying, in public school, that age group. I just found out last year that at our local high school, there is a secret LGBTQ club, and they can't officially, or they won't officially say we're a club. I don't, or when they put on the down low, and that kind of, it surprised me that A, there was one, and B, that they had to keep it secret was, kind of saddened me. But that same group actually came to me via their faculty person, and they were considering, they wanted my thoughts on if doing their own gay pride here in Hyden. And I didn't know what to say at that point, because I thought that, if you can't have an open club at your high school, man, I don't know about, that's going full tilt, and having a whole festival in the town. They ended up, I think, maybe going, they ended up not doing anything because of COVID. But what the plan, I think they had decided, was to maybe take them to a couple of gay prides in the area, Moorhead or Pikeville, or some of the ones, or Lexington. That was going to be the plan first, to kind of dip their toe into the water that way, and before they just kind of went full tilt with one here. Because I don't know how that would go over still. I think it's one thing, having relationships and knowing people who are gay, but I think it would be a totally different ballgame if they, someone wanted to do like a gay pride in a small town like this.
Okay. So this next question is for Ray, and I'm going to go ahead and apologize because I'm pretty sure I used the incorrect pronoun when I was introducing you. But the question is, if you're comfortable talking about it, what are your struggles with peers in the workplace, family, or anyone else misgendering you, and how do you deal with it? Is that something you feel comfortable addressing?
Yeah, I mean, a little bit. So I am relatively recently out as non-binary, and don't actually talk about it a lot publicly or privately. And I don't necessarily recommend this, but I kind of came out as non-binary in the first episode of this season of my podcast, because I was like, if I'm going to do this, this is a good moment, and I don't really want to talk about it. And so that mostly has gone great, but I will say that I have a little bit of a weird disconnect between my like public professional media life that is very queer, and in that space people just like got it and ran, right? And then my like personal, local life, where I think if I wanted to talk about it more and had more conversations with people, the process would be smoother or quicker or something. But I will say I've just in the past month moved back home to West Virginia, where I grew up. And so in Kentucky, where I was, it's been about a year almost since I started using a different name and different pronouns, and people there like got it. And I've recently moved home, and so now I'm with like family and people I grew up with my whole life who like don't listen to the podcast, have no idea. And so I'm in a new place of like, how do I want to navigate this? When do I feel like I need to push this? When does it not matter? And all that to say, I think I'm still very much on a journey with it. But it is interesting to move, 2 miles away from my mom, or, back home where I'm hanging out with people, or actually not in person yet, but texting with people who I've known since I was 4. It's going to take people in this context a lot longer to get used to this, understandably, and so my struggles and my navigation are ongoing, I guess, is what I would say.
Yes. Okay, another question is, let's say I imagine rural places to be isolating for LGBTQIA youth. Where can they go to find support and acceptance?
I think there's always, I'm saying always, I think most of the time there's at least 1 or 2 teachers, at your school who are accepting, and they tend to make themselves known. I think I think they try, at least here, to to know that, you know, hey, you can talk to me, I'm a safe play, you know, or try to have all-inclusive events or that kind of thing, and just kind of, I would start there, looking there, and then, well, I mean, it's tough. It's very tough in small towns to find, you know, that group, but they're there. There are people there. That's one reason that, you know, Andy and I both decided we were definitely not going to hide who we were when we came back to Hyden, because, you know, that is one, you know, I want people, younger people, to see, you know, that there are gay people here, you know, living and working, and I do think that's why we tend to get employees that, you know, want to come and work for us because of that, and you know, or know that we're accepting of them.
And the only thing I'd add is just, I do think there's so much online now in terms of queer community. And I know for myself, even as a queer adult, like a lot of my queer community and connection comes online and not in my local day-to-day interactions. And there's downsides to that, of course, but there is just so much there. Ideally, we'd all have like also all that support locally that we could see face to face, but there's just a lot of resources online for young people, for older people, for anybody really.
Okay. Our next question is, many of our college-age students have been negatively affected by the pandemic and have been forced to move in with their parents after living on their own and finding their own safe space. So suddenly, many of our LGBTQ plus students are not permitted to live authentically at home. So what advice could you offer our students who feel unsupported in their new living circumstances, or even their current living circumstances?
Again, I mean, I really do think it's important to plug into your community and your support networks where they are, you know, and so still, I mean, I'll be 36 this year, and I often still can feel incredibly isolated from queer community in the place that I live, and I wouldn't survive it without really close friendships with queer and trans people in different places. I would hope, I guess I'd say, that some of those college-age students who are living at home now, like, have some friends somewhere they can call, they can text. I mean, I just think it can do so much when you're in a space where you're not able to be your authentic self, to like build in times in your week, in your day where you can with someone. It's not a long-term sustainable plan, but in a hopefully sort of not ongoing setup, hopefully at some point students will be able to move back to campus or wherever, you know, just like leaning on who you've got, I guess is what I'm saying, and reaching out to make new connections there when you need them.
Okay. The next question is, I teach at one of the rural colleges and want to know what is the best way to let students know that I'm an ally and am available for support.
I would say, you know, making sure that they know that. Just, you know, you may just have to say at the beginning of the semester or whenever, you know, hey, by the way, this is me, or put it in your syllabus. You know, I'm an ally and support you, you know, for whatever situation that you may be in. You know, feel free to come to me with something, or with any concerns, or, you know, have something that they can see, a sign or something in your room or on your computer, you know, if it's online at this point. But, you know, just, I think that sometimes that's all you need is just someone to say, by the way, you know, it's safe to talk about this, you know, something with me, or feel free to do that. And I think a lot of times teachers, with their material that you teach can, not necessarily, I guess, in the science and math, but I'm thinking more English stuff. A lot of the assignments that you have can kind of indirectly say to a student, you know, if they're assigning this, they must be comfortable with this, you know, area too.
Yeah, actually, this is Justin Weiss. I'm the one that asked that question. I just wanted to follow up something more specific. Something I've noticed in the past 10 years is when I teach meiosis, sex cell development. Obviously, the genetic determination of biological sex is brought up. Even I've noticed I've started saying biological sex instead of just sex in general. But I mean, I guess that's one way I do it. And I also try to tell them too that, you know, there is a difference between sex and gender and all that. And again, I'm learning all of this. This is all, I mean, still relatively new, but I mean, I can definitely point across the animal kingdom that even biological sex is quite variable in the way that it works. But I guess the reason why I asked that question is, it's like, I don't want to just come out and say, hey, I'm an ally, everybody. And then like, all of a sudden you got half people in the room and sitting there like, what the hell? And I'm just thinking, you know, how do you do it without saying, look at me, and just like, and just tell people, hey, I'm here for you if you need me. I guess that's why I was asking that.
I mean, I think, just to chime in for a second, things like including your pronouns in your email signature or even on the syllabus. I think Keith hit something on the head with, you know, the curriculum and the way we teach. And, you know, you said you recognize, you know, when you teach the different sex cell division and all of that, like there's all these little things that can really add up and let students know that, you know, you're more open-minded, or that, you know, that will make them more comfortable coming to you. And then of course someone commented in the chat, you know, put rainbow swag on your door. So yeah, I think there are a variety of things. I think the fact that you're asking that question is really important because it shows that you're trying to make an effort.
Well, and I'll tell you why I started doing that is one year I went over the whole sex chromosome thing, and I had someone blatantly say out loud, haha, there's evidence for two genders right there. And I was like, wait a second, no, that's not it. There's more to it than that. And that's when I started really doing the research and trying to figure out the better way to teach that.
Yeah, those moments definitely will encourage us to reconsider how we think things or to look at it differently. Okay. If you have more questions, type them in the chat or let us know. I will go ahead and ask another one. You know, I think both of you have probably answered this, but I'm going to bring it up just in case. You know, being LGBTQ and living in a rural area, sometimes you feel a lot of pressure to leave. And I know, Ray, you said that you hope you never have to leave again. But, you know, and I guess too, both of you, your experiences were not coming out until you had left. But do you think that in order to live authentically, do you need to leave, or did you need to leave, even if that's meant coming back? You know, for me, I had suspected for a long time that I was a lesbian or not heterosexual, at least. And then once I realized it completely, I knew I needed to leave before I could come out. But that's just my experience, you know, so everyone's experience is different. You know, how do you feel about that?
I know that for me, in order to live authentically, I had to leave first. I had to break these bonds that were here that I grew up with in order, and I think I needed to do that, not just being gay, to be myself in general, to break these family ties and things that, you know, I guess ideas that you are raised with in these small towns and stuff, and just to open up my world. And moving, I never, like I think I said earlier, I never thought that I would come back, because I loved living, you know, in a bigger city, in Orlando and even Lexington, you know. But you know, things happen, and it's I like living here now. I do keep, like I said, a house in Lexington because, you know, you can't live in a bubble here, like the bubble that I would like to live in. And so, you know, I do have to have that little outlet that I can leave here and, you know, and go and, you know, be with some people who are more like me, you know, who think more like me and have the same interests as I do. But yeah, I think it would be much harder to not have left and come back, to do it all strictly here in Hyden. And, you know, honestly, I think it's maybe a generational thing too. I think I see people my age, older people, who are still living this straight life. They're married, and, you know, I know that they're not straight. I know that they're not happy, and, you know, they never left here. They got married after high school or college and stayed here, and I know they weren't able to break free and live their authentic selves. But I think maybe, and like I said, it may be a generational thing. I think younger people may have an easier time not leaving, but I could be wrong. I've been wrong before.
Yeah, I have wondered before, like, what would, how would I, when and how and where would I have figured this out if I hadn't left? You know what I mean? Like, what would that journey have been like? Who knows? I have no idea, actually. In retrospect, I'm like, oh yeah, I already sort of knew. I just didn't have everything that I had ever seen as an example felt so far away from who I was and where I was that I couldn't, like, combine it until I met some people my age. You know what I mean? But I am also really grateful that I left, right? I mean, I think that there's a lot that I learned through leaving, not just about, like, queerness and my gender and all these things, like, but I just learned a lot through different landscapes, meeting different people, living in places with, like, a lot more racial diversity, with a lot more political, well, yeah, a lot more political diversity, religious diversity, you know what I mean? Like, I learned so much through that process of leaving. And so I don't think that, like, I think if people need to go and can go, they should go. You know what I mean? And I really want it to be possible for anyone who wants to stay or who doesn't have the choice of leaving to be able to, like, thrive, right? And I will say that 8 years into this project, Country Queers, which I started very much out of, like, okay, I'm home. In some ways, I'm, like, happier and more settled and more just, like, okay than I've been since I left in the past decade, because of how attached I am to this landscape, because of, you know, just that you grow up in Appalachia, it's hard to feel totally at home anywhere else, I think. But also I felt really isolated. And so I feel like, you know, 8 years later, 70 some interviews with rural queer people all over the country later, I still need this project as much as I did when I started it, because I still am like, okay, there's things about this I've figured out, you know. And there's things that I still have moments when I'm having a hard day, when, like, things aren't working. I'm like, I am insane for trying to do this by myself on this mountain. I'm going to be single for the rest of my life. I'm like, I can't have my closest queer friends be, like, 4 hours away. Like, what am I doing? You know? So I think all that is just to say, whew, there's still a lot of work to be done, but I'm really stubborn, and I really believe that, like, every queer person who grows up in West Virginia, in East Kentucky, in East Tennessee, anywhere in the country should be able to stay and have everything we need. So that's the world I'm dreaming of. We clearly have a long ways to go.
It's the world you're helping create. One last question, real quick, because we've got about 5 minutes. Someone asked, many of y'all are probably in areas where religion and queerness intersect in all the wrong ways. Do you have any insight to navigating these murky waters?
Yes, I'm definitely, as most of us, I think, living in Kentucky in general, have that. And I've fallen victim to it, as I think Savannah knows. For Halloween one year, dressed as Kim Davis, the county clerk who refused to issue a marriage license in Moorhead. And I dressed as her, and Andy dressed as her husband. And I posted a picture of our costumes on Facebook, and like it was seen as I was making fun of the religion of the people who wear dresses all the time and the wig and that stuff, and it led to a complete boycott of my Subway restaurant. I mean, like, the villagers were with the torches. I was blasted, and there were, it was terrible, a terrible, terrible time for a good month because of that. And it's the religious aspect, especially in a lot of these fundamental religions that are so popular here. It's very trying, and I don't see that is changing. I think it may possibly be getting worse. And so no matter how things are going, kids that are caught up in that religion are growing up gay and having to attend those churches, and that's tough. And I don't see a way out, until they are old enough to break away from that.
Ray, any thoughts real quick?
Only that I feel like because I was raised by hippies, we did not go to church. This was so not a part of my life that it's been a thing that I've had to navigate, like, living in the region, but not in that way that I think is so painful for so many people I've interviewed, where it's like your whole family, your whole community is tied up in the church. And so I feel like there's ways in which I just was very lucky to not have to go through that particular kind of painful process. And it's come up in, I'd say, every interview I've done in Appalachia. Religion, the church, navigating this has come up, and other parts of the country too, but definitely in the South, and especially that it's just so common that that it's a real hard part of the process for folks.
And I also will say that I think at this point, that was a few years ago, and I think that we've gotten a good working relationship with at Subway now with these churches and stuff. And we have a lot of customers still. They boycott now, and we have a lot of regulars that come after the Wednesday night service, and they come every a group of them. So I think they are learning to live with us, and we're learning to live with them. So maybe time will help.
It's complex, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I want to thank both of you for taking the time to join us today. This has been fantastic. Thank all of you for attending.